our series of virtual interviews with our leaders of humanity. And today we have the pleasure to welcome Margit Osterloh, emeritus professor for organization, technology, and innovation management. And the reason why I'm in academia, one can fairly say that, because she's my doctoral mother, my academic role model, and my mentor. And of course, we are going to do later an even more proper introduction. But before we do this, as usual, I will lead you through the quest for the good organizations and how we place these interviews in it. So, as you know, we are going to have a lovely introduction in a second. Then we are going to enter our critical dialogue. And in the end, hopefully, we have all learned the art of making a difference. Mm-hmm. If I kind of position it in a little bit more broader context, as we will see on the next slide, then you see this is part of our quest for the search for the good organizations, which is a heartfelt passion of also my co-host Otti, whom I forgot to introduce here as well, to turn our suffering machines, as we call organizations nowadays, into corporations which are buzzing with aliveness, which allow co-creation towards the common good, not only the commons, as we're going to discuss with Margit probably later, and which are also directed towards their larger ecosystem and society. The task is quite bold. I think we are aware of that. And knowledge spans centuries, and that's why we need people like Margit, our leaders for humanity, who have a deep expertise and knowledge, who also have, as we believe, practical wisdom, because they have been leaders in their own domains as well and have faced the same questions, and which have shown that they are also able to step into the role of a citizen and of communityship. And without further ado, I would now suggest that we are starting our talk with Margit, and I hand over to Otti for the proper introduction.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And again, a very warm welcome, Margit. It's a huge pleasure to have you here. And many of our listeners will already know Margit Osterloh. It's certainly a person who needs very little introduction, for sure in the German-speaking domains, as a thought leader, as an academic leader, and as a board member on some of the biggest companies in Switzerland. And Margit has, throughout her career, especially her academic career, touched on a number of very interesting topics that are relevant for our inquiry across business ethics and governance, gender studies, organizational studies, and wider connotations of management and society in academia. And we will, I'm sure, touch on a number of the more controversial suggestions and sometimes critical suggestions Margit has been making. And I would say from a personal perspective, Margit, I think whilst reading from many of your publications, one of the things that makes me especially proud to have you on the program today is your courage. I felt that sometimes you have taken risks to speak up in a very critical fashion and making some suggestions and proposals that probably for many of your academic and even kind of political colleagues have been quite new, so to speak. And I think that is something that we are certainly looking out for. Critical thinkers and people who can combine an understanding of politics, of the human nature, and of management science. And of course, the other credentials are on the slide: a director of a research institute, an honorary member of the German Academic Association for Business Research, a visiting professor and emeritus professor, University of Zurich and University of Basel, and so on. And I think just to tease us into this dialogue, some of the things that we really found very, very interesting were your research on CEO incentives. And I think you have been very outspoken sometimes about those, and certainly random selection. And I'm sure that is something we will hear more about later. So again, Margit, I'm sure I'm not doing this enough credit, but a warm welcome on behalf of both of Antoinette and myself.
Thank you very much for that very friendly introduction.
Wonderful, but I think probably not exactly the right introduction. So the first question, Margit, many listeners will wonder, who is this person beyond the headlines? Who is Margit Osterloh? How would you possibly describe yourself with a few attributes?
I'm by education mechanical engineer plus economics, and I think that was an important Prägung, how to translate that. I think that make me like I'm today. So I'm in both areas. I'm accustomed to think like an engineer on the one hand and like a social scientist on the other hand. I came to the academia at a very, I'm a late girl, so to say. I became a professor when I was 47 because I worked for 7 years in a company, and then I started to do my PhD, which meant that I was a PhD, I think, when I was 38. So, and I think that also had a great impact on how I think and how I live, because. So I'm a bit proud to say I know about what I'm speaking and writing a little bit more than some other scholars who never had seen a company from the inside. So I think this. I have a son, so I was divorced, and today I'm married again with Bruno Frey. So I think these are the most important things about me.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Antoinette,
Yeah.
Next question to you.
Yeah, exactly. I have to ask you this, although you have almost already answered that. I think why Otti and I are on this quest, because we are also a little bit in a midlife crisis and believe that the world needs to become better. So I was kind of wondering, what, if ever you had a midlife crisis, what did it make to you, and what was the result of that?
I never had a midlife crisis.
I knew that.
Never. Because I started, as I told you, at a late age with my academic career, and I was so eager to manage it. In the beginning, I didn't feel very safe in that job, so I had no time for midlife crisis.
Maybe building on that, the midlife crisis, in some will probably suggest is a search for a good life, for what it really means to live well. Looking back at the phases of your life, Margit, how would you define the good life, or a life worth living, as Aristotle would have said today? What is that for you?
The life I'm living is the life I ever wanted to live. I am happy to say that I'm a very privileged position. I can do whatever I want. I have a lot of freedom about what I'm writing, what I'm doing. I live in relative wealth, so I can afford the things I want to afford too. I don't need a yacht or some brilliance. I don't need this, but I love to have a good life without thinking how can I pay what I want to have tomorrow. So this is a very privileged position I have, and I wish that more people could enjoy this life.
I think that, Antoinette, that sounds a lot like Bill Torbert's notion of the good life is good money, good friends, and above all, good questions. Final question.
Yeah, the Reihenfolge, how to say?
Order. Yeah.
The order.
Good friends is the most important thing.
Very interesting. Bill Torbert was advocating good questions to be the first.
Good questions as well.
And I have a bit of the feeling that good questions are very important to you as well, because you never stop.
Good friends ask good questions.
Okay.
Very true.
So I would suggest with that we dive into our many questions we have for you, because we're sure that you are going to help us to answer these. And so maybe we start with the first question, and then the first question is really, if we look at the landscape and try to map good organizations, then we hear such a lot of different terms like conscious capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, ESG, CSR. It becomes very quickly very confusing. And we were kind of thinking, because you did research in that, you taught it, that you help us a little bit from a business ethics perspective, what really is a good business, and whether there are different approaches within business ethics we could have a look at, and then kind of try to delineate that more clearly.
To start with, I grew up with my doctoral father was Horst Steinmann, and at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, and he taught me, and I really find this very important, about the Habermasian ethics of dialogue. And I think this is the foundation of what I believe is a good company, a company that makes it possible that there are structural conditions which allow to a highest degree this kind of communicative ethical thinking. That's a basic idea. And then we could talk about how to do this. That's a difficult question, but that's the basis, that's the ground.
And on this, Margit, can I just ask a probably not very clever follow-up question? When I looked at Habermas, it appeared that the idea that through communication processes some ethics would emerge, it seemed it would only work under very special conditions. So it was actually never a certainty that such a universal ethic would come about. So is ethics therefore, is a good business therefore ever contingent, so contextual in a specific area, or is there something like a universal moral standard that we should all adhere to in your reading?
I think the universal moral standing is communication, free communication, a communication without pressure. But I admire Habermas very much, but in his philosophy, institutions do not play a role. To be honest, they don't play any role. And he doesn't think about how institutions must be constructed, that this is communication, powerless in communication. No, there is no powerless communication, but communication with only which is not too much
unilateral power, but
unilateral. I think then the problem of organization theorists, like I define myself, begins.
Absolutely. And I was, whilst you were commenting, I was thinking about Foucault, who would clearly argue that power in dialogic processes has such a strong role, and therefore I would almost think that positing that communication can lead us to a specific form of ethic without realizing the role power plays is very difficult, isn't it? So we would need to understand the power structure inside the organization very clearly as well to help with the communication.
Of course, power plays a role. All these structures we have to think about, they entail power. What kind of structures are structural powers? And therefore, this is my job, and this was my job, to reflect how you can balance power on the one hand and free speech on the other hand. I could translate it into another vocabulary. I could translate it into we have to manage the Spannung. How to translate Spannung?
The tension
between Gesinnungsethik and Verantwortungsethik, or to say ethics of conviction versus ethics of responsibility. I like better to say ethics of consequences, because that's exactly what ethics of responsibility means. That behaving in an ethics of conviction way has some consequences which are based in the nature of the people, and we have to reflect that. We have to know we have to have a high knowledge about how people behave in different situations, which makes them behave like they behave. And we have always to balance these both sides of of tension, and that's a difficult thing in constructing organizational structures, all kinds of institutional structures, by the way, in organizations as well as in society.
I think that's also something we are going to touch later when we are talking about how to organize or operationalize that in organizations, because of course that is also linked to your work on crowding out, where that would be a problem for the convictions then, and how then the ethics of responsibility would fit in and how they have to look like. So that's going to be hopefully a rich discussion later we have to take up again. But I don't want to leave you off the hook so quickly from the ethical and societal view, because I can remember that a long time ago when I was sitting in your lecture series, you were always talking about the honorable businessman. So that stick with me. And then I tried to find out, is that still alive and kicking? And then I really found it, but I found it quite interesting how they define the honorable businessman today. So the honorable businessman or woman recognizes and takes responsibility for the economic and social order and heeds the principle of equity and good faith. Is that enough? Because I mean, that would, for instance, also entail that honorable businessmen could still lobby against regulations. I mean, how do you see that concept in is it good or evil perspective nowadays?
So I think we both agree that regulations are important. It is important how regulations are created, whether this is a democratic way or in a way which is not quite democratic, but gives a high degree of self-determination inside of companies. So how rules are created, that's the most important thing. You know better than me. Then we have different kinds of fairness, which means procedural fairness, outcome fairness, and we both probably are convinced that procedural fairness is the most important thing, and this should be the case inside and outside companies. That means that the decisions are made in a way that are procedural fair, and people believe and feel that is procedural fair. It's a perception in the first place.
So is there something, Margit, and sorry, we're a little bit, I wouldn't say lost, but we're still very troubled by the ethical questions. So we are throwing some of our thoughts at you, apologies, but ethics of conviction, that sounds very close to virtue ethics in my interpretation of what you just said. So it's more that we bring the desire to act well in the context of the society we're in to the table, as opposed to counting utilitarian consequences. And in that context, we would probably all try to create the rules, like you just said, in a fair, procedurally fair fashion. And therefore, to Antoinette's point, I reckon if then der ehrbare Kaufmann, the honorable merchant, is honorable, they would not try to unilaterally influence regulation or government. Is that a fair integration?
I'm a bit hesitating because, of course, there are forms of lobbying we do not like. But I would never say that lobbying is in any case a bad thing. There is a kind of lobbyism which is acceptable as long as it is controlled, as long as it is transparent. Then lobbyism in democracy, lobbyism has its place, definitely. We could speak later about our idea of random selection, which helps to dampen lobbyisms, but it will never disappear. And it is impossible that it disappears. And I'm a realist. I'm looking about what happens in reality, and I'm taking that into account. That means ethics of consequences.
So that means almost checks and balances. So we need to nurture.
Checks and balances is a very good expression for that. Yeah.
So we need to nurture the civic sense of civility, almost, of being part and growing with and within society. But we probably need some safety mechanisms. And Antoinette, that sounds very close to your thinking.
Which probably is not a wonder that it's close to my thinking. But then we could maybe develop that a little bit, because this is something which sits very squarely in it's almost a German take on ethics, a very big one, institutional ethics. What I can remember about institutional ethics, but that's exactly what you don't mean, but maybe you still can elaborate a little bit more, was that we visited Hohmann. And Hohmann's idea was that we need to design institutions which are proof for even homo economic. So that the crooks, which are already there, have no chance to be crooks. That was his idea. Now, obviously, that's not your idea. But if you would develop that a little bit with the theory of control, what type of regulations, be it more changing the price mechanisms, be it more formal regulations, or even kind of to try to enable peer control from the state point of view, would you suggest on that institutional level?
First of all, Hohmann's standpoint about the homo economicus safe institutions is insofar wrong, as Hohmann doesn't understand nearly nothing about what we call psychological economics. And that means that people don't behave always like homo economici. They, in some situations, they behave like homo economici, but in many situations they do not. And we must take into account in our institution building theories under which circumstances people behave in which way. And though we should know many facts from psychology, social psychology, as you do, that's in particular the work you are doing. So much to Hohmann. The next question: in principle, I'm a capitalist. I think capitalism is not the worst institutional order we have. Of course, I would play for a social capitalism, for a capitalism which is eingebunden, how to
embedded in an institutional framework,
in social institutional framework, and of course we have the idea that this institutional framework must make sure that we have as much individual freedom as we could have, and that people are incentivized and encouraged to contribute as much as possible to common goods. Of course, that's the idea. And am I sure we can do this? Later you will ask me about the people I admire most, and my answer would clearly be Elinor Ostrom, because she did that in a way I really admire.
It's very interesting. I want to, and Antoinette, I'm thinking Paul Adler, when we talk to him, will probably argue the opposite and say capitalism cannot. Paul Adler, who will
Paul Adler, yes, yeah,
he will suggest capitalism cannot be saved. And I think Henry Mintzberg was saying last week that certainly any adjectival capitalism, so social capitalism, caring capitalism, conscious capitalism, in his books, do not really work. We need something which is kind of a capitalistic something else, which is much more related to the society that we want. But I think this is a very interesting discussion. But Margit, I want to ask you one other thing related to the ethics. How would you measure goodness? And as you just said, you're a capitalist. So what's the role of profit in your definition of what good is in a societal or business context?
Profit is insofar important as we know that the wealthier a country is, the more altruistic are its people. At the moment, I'm dealing with a problem which was very new for me. which means that the preferences of people are changing according to the wealth of a nation and according to the inequality or equality degree of a nation. And what comes out is first that people behave more in an altruistic way the richer they are. Secondly, that the preferences of men and women, which I'm working in gender economics, the preferences of men and women, the gap of preferences between men and women enlarges the richer a country is. This really struck me, and I'm doing at the moment the research how to explain this fact. But what I want to emphasize is wealth is necessary that people become more altruistic. And therefore, as institutional economists, we have to care for wealth and profit making. We need for becoming wealthier. Very easy.
So are there not a number of assumptions under that? One is this famous, if the water rises, then kind of everybody will be better off. And I think someone like Piketty would probably argue that actually is not necessarily true. We've seen for the last 20 years an increase in GDP per capita, but at the same time, most of the normal workers have actually not benefited from that increase in GDP at country level. And then secondly, I think...
That's not true. That's true in some countries, UK, quite clear, United States, quite clear. It's not true for Switzerland. And therefore, my opinion is that the institutional framework we have in Switzerland is a better one than in most other countries. And we should reflect what makes a difference. So in Switzerland, inequality has not risen after taxes. After taxes, that's quite clear, but that's part of the system.
And I think if we look at research, we see a correlation with the Gini coefficient. So I think the question is inequality increasing with an increase in wealth? And I think you're probably pointing to the fact if inequality is not rising, as is the case in certainly a number of European countries, those altruistic effects could come to bear, exactly like you say. But my second question would be related to Stefano Zamagni's criticism of what he called the mixed economy model. So the typical Samuelson style, we've got a capitalistic market system, and then we've got institutions that will correct and redistribute wealth. Mm-hmm. And he would probably argue it's not altruism that we want. We want an economy that in itself is creating better employment and more wealth through the activities rather than redistribution. What's your view on that?
Of course, a redistribution is the second best way. That's for sure. The best way is that people earn their own money and can be proud of the money they earn for themselves. That would be the better way. And what we have to do to help people to earn a good salary is to educate them, to give them as much education as we could. That's for sure. That's for sure. And we have to create institutions who help poor people with a bad socioeconomic background really to reach this state. Yes.
Well, I'm just like to dig a little bit deeper because we can see with the example of Switzerland, we have high happiness figures. So and the other things you have explained us. So I think there is this correlation clearly between more equality and wealth on the one side and happiness on the other side. But if I look at Swiss companies, we still have a number of Swiss companies which produce enormous negative externalities. For instance, by still laying off people or more clearly kind of producing environmental costs. I do believe that we also have in Switzerland our cases of wrongdoings. So I think the analysis of Henry Mintzberg that there is a certain case for corporate irresponsibility rather than responsibility also holds for Switzerland. So I just want to throw the ball back at you. What should we do in these cases? Is it also a matter of kind of we need to teach business ethics in universities and then they will become better? Can we change something in this institutional ethic frameworks in order to prevent that? Because this is where you're coming from. What's your view on this?
I think I always think that we should look on the framework, on the institutional framework, because frameworks have a lot of advantages. Frameworks or should be created that they equally they are equal for everybody. That's one thing. Secondly, within this framework, you can, to a certain extent, but to a high extent, autonomously, and these are two very, very important preconditions. So direct interventions in most cases are the worst thing.
Mm-hmm. So we'll have to internalize, for instance, external effects.
Of course, by prices, by CO2 prices, and so on. That is always, in principle, the best idea. But of course, they are different rules at different times. For example, in Corona times, we had very, very special, very direct regulations, and there was no way out. Maybe one could do it so one way or the other a little bit differently, but on a whole, I think Switzerland managed it quite well because the rules were supported by the public meaning.
So the participation again is really important. Yes. I just have one more question, Otti, because I still try to kind of get through at the problem. Is it then on the other side, because you also say you are a convinced capitalist, maybe a good idea to start with rankings of ethical companies and then we are going to have more ethical companies?
No, rankings are in nearly every case maybe without sports, but I don't understand much about sports, so I should be silent on this issue. I think rankings have always negative side effects, which means that people try to manipulate, like to look only on the factors which are measurable. And we know very well that sometimes the issues which are not very good measurable are the more important ones. So rankings in nearly every case are a bad thing. What is might be better is awards. Awards are different from rankings.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that was another thing we discussed with Stefan Zamani, and he would claim exactly the same. I'm just trying to get so what we've said, the goodness has a lot to do with communications and creating the framework for allowing participative rule setting, and in that context being very aware of power dynamics. Then I think you said creating rank. Go on.
It's what was perfectly as you said it perfectly.
Yeah, thank you. Then I'll try to build. So the rankings, and we've seen your writings and some of your teaching on rankings, of course, are not necessarily the right way. Profit still plays a role in enabling that creativity in a capitalistic system that raises the level for everybody, if that again is embedded in an institutional framework. And I think again you're pointing out the importance of almost equality of access, certainly in terms of education, which I think is certainly something that will resonate also with Paul's view. I wanted to go a little bit onto CSR. So this corporate social responsibility movement, and we will talk to Ed Freeman in a few weeks. So I just wonder, if we crunch it up, the last 50 years of CSR, what's your perspective? Is the world, so maybe has it worked? Are we in a better place today than before? And what are the lessons learned? And then I will then I will ask you about stakeholder theory, so we can take your analysis to Ed when we speak to him.
I'm not so sure that CSR was really successful. it could be the case that capitalistic forces are much more forceful. For example, if I go along the streets, I see advertisement of companies like, I think, Shell company or some oil company. They make advertisement that with CO2 taxes, they behave in a environment friendly way. That's obviously greenwashing. That's quite, but is greenwashing so bad? If it helps Shell to become a better company in the sense that they make profits, that's for sure, they have to make profit. But on the other hand, they have to care for environment more than they did it before, because otherwise they get a bad reputation. So what's wrong about it? I think greenwashing is not so bad, because it gives an incentive to the companies to look at issues they didn't look at before.
But is there not, I'm going back to your distinction between ethics on conviction and ethics of consequences. And talking about Shell, I think the court case that happened in the Netherlands a few months back was very interesting, because the court, and I'm not a lawyer, but I looked at the judgment that was made. And basically, the conviction of Shell was on the basis of an institute in the Dutch legal code, which requests of every citizen and corporate citizen to take care of the society and including future generations. And based on that principle, Shell was convicted. So that for me sounds like an ethics of conviction. So we are all part of this. We have to take care of each other. Whereas when we say greenwashing could also be good, that for me looks more, in my experience as well, as a companies trying to comply with a deontological set of rules. And in reality, we've got a lot of research that shows that the predisposition to behave ethically is reduced whenever people go into this compliance mindset. So how do you bring those aspects together? If greenwashing is just, I go with the regulation, but I don't really take care of the planet, could it not just then also perpetuate an immorality, what Antoinette called the kind of social irresponsibility of corporations?
It could be the case, but there's the role of the press, for example, which comes in. The public opinion, the Fridays for Future movement. We have a lot of social movements who are very active and are very sensible for the wrong type of greenwashing. So I think it works quite well. And by the way, the principles of the ethics of conviction, they are changing. There's a lot of the world is changing. What we behave is acceptable today, which was acceptable in former times, and is no longer acceptable today. Take the question of slavery. Until the 19th century, slavery was accepted. Today, we can't believe it, but it is a case. Or look at countries like Afghanistan, where women have no rights. It seems to be acceptable there. It's not acceptable with us. So we have to take that into account, whether we like it or not. But what people behave is fair and according to the rules they want to live with, that changes.
I couldn't agree more. Yet on the other hand, that could lead to a very dangerous cultural and contextual relativism, which ultimately leads to nihilism, because of course we have also got the capitalistic context that is constantly pushing the boundaries on what is allowed. And I don't know what would be your commentary on that Reif Eigen CEO case that came up in Switzerland 2 weeks ago when I was there with Antoinette. So the Reif Eigen CEO seemed to have received 14 million annual salary aside from the transparently what was it, the salary that was officially shown, right? So these type of behaviors certainly are unacceptable. Or
of course, it's Vincent's house, Antoinette?
Pierin Vincents.
Huh?
Pierin Vincents.
Yeah, Pierin Vincents, yeah. That's a clear case of hubris. We can talk about that later. And that's a problem about these star heroes. which are created partly by the press, partly by themselves, because they can profit from it. And there was no institutional form of controlling these guys. And we have to look for institutions which exactly do that. Yeah. And lotteries, focal lotteries would be an instrument to hinder these kind of abuse. He's a typical example, a very typical example of hybris. We can do something against it.
Yeah, and I think we go over to the next section. Yeah. But what we do before is just a quick wrap up, because what I heard, and I don't know, we have heard already quite a nice summaries, but I heard that institutional ethics is extremely important. So we need the right framework, institutional framework around it, which should be preferably enabling and not coercive rules, which should be fair, that is also participatively designed rules. I heard also that social movements, in your opinion, are very important. So here you come very close to this balanced society that Henry has in his mind. And they're important for two things. They can look for further regulation. They can lobby for further regulations. But I also heard you that they are also bringing up new ethical topics. Mm-hmm. So like now we are, for instance, talking about colonialism. What does this mean later? So there is also this effect, which is very important. And I would just like to also draw back to the very first thing you were saying. There would be also a universal ethics we can all define if we would follow the dialogic ethics that Habermas has once lined out, if only we knew how to implement that. Is that kind of a fair summary?
How to implement that with institutions we have to reflect about. That's what I told you in the beginning. As far as I know, Habermas has no ideas about institutions who really can enable this kind of ethics.
So, and I think that is what I'm taking away from the first section as well. And I'm looking at Marcus Gabriel, who wrote a very interesting book on moralischer Fortschritt in dunklen Zeiten, so moral progress in dark times. Mm-hmm. And he's arguing for something that he calls moral facts, where he says kind of killing your parents is never a good idea. So in reality, whilst there's cultural or contextual connotations, there are certain things that we should all agree on that are moral or immoral. Mm-hmm. And I think my challenge with contextual ethics is that the capitalistic system is creating a hedonic treadmill. You were just talking about hubris in individuals and immaturity in leaders, especially male leaders. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm still troubled whether we can, just through better dialogue, resolve the challenges that we have. Because arguably, in countries like the United States, what we are living is not good. Henry pointed out that on every relevant statistics in the last 20 years, we're going into the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. So I guess we need some sort of reset before positive communications can come in. But that is what's on my mind after this kind of very interesting first section. Thank you. So Antoinette, we go into the second, which is about organizations. And again, given that you have the privilege of knowing Margit's teachings a lot better, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, gladly, because we already started. And I think a long-running topic of yours is corporate governance. And before we go into the hubris, because of course that's one of your big accomplishments to look at this much more clearly, I would like to tease out a little bit of your experiences on boards and what went well or is a good aspect of the board, and where you believe that boards at present have really limitations and cannot do what they are supposed to do.
As you know, we have two different kinds of board systems. The German ones, where there are inside and outside directors, which has advantages and disadvantages, and the Swiss and the English, UK, and also American board system, where you have mostly inside directors. And I think, to be clearly, I prefer the German systems, that there are outside directors, and that there are directors which are elected by the employees. This comes closest to the idea of corporate governance, which I believe is good. And the background is that quite clear, shareholder capitalism is not a good form of capitalism, because it's not correct to say that only the capital owners should be represented at the highest level. And the reason why is that it's not only the shareholders who invest firm specific. The idea who owns a company is that the owner of the company is the person who is dependent on the residual claim of the company on the profit, which cannot be contracted. And in former times, people believe, and that's the idea behind shareholder capitalism, that only shareholder capitalists do invest in the company in a way which cannot be contracted ex ante. Today, we know that also employees, that also customers and so on, they investing as well in the company, in particular their knowledge, their tacit knowledge, and so on. And this is the reason why today I think the pure shareholder capitalism is out. Because the more and more tacit knowledge, or knowledge in general and tacit knowledge in particular, is important for the competitive advantage of a company, the more these investors, called stakeholders, become important, and they should be represented at the top level of the company. That's the first thing. The second thing is how to organize it. That's a different. That's a related question, but it's a very difficult one. But in principle, this is the background of my idea about corporate governance. Unfortunately, not many people in Switzerland or in the United States do share these views. With academics, there are some people who share it, but with practitioners, they don't believe in this kind of corporate governance. Yes.
So, I mean, I read that that's also a suggestion to make stakeholder management operational in this way. We're talking about these two representative bodies. So I guess one representative body would be more the inside directors, and the other one would be really with this elected stakeholders and workers. Yeah, but of course, the interesting question is, I mean, you say that, but I mean, how to get there is the question, because I think these ideas have been around not only from your side, although you're kind of really bringing them much more forward, but they have been around for 30 years. What can we do in order to bring that into corporate governance?
As a Swiss person, my first idea would be to make a referenda. I'm very curious about the referenda we will have in November about the so-called Justizinitiative. And in this referenda, the idea is that the highest judges should be elected or selected with a partly random selection. And so this is a different question than corporate governance, but I'm sure it will not be accepted, but the discussion about random selection will be fueled, and that will make a difference. So I think, or hope that in, let me say, 5 or 10 years, the issue of random selection will become much more popular than it is today. It starts. You know that the Swiss National Foundation partly applies focal random selection. And that's a great breakthrough, because the Swiss National Foundation, that's the most scientific organization you could imagine. And if such an organization introduces a very new system of selection, then this is a good ground for moving forward in that direction. So I think one has to be patient. Such big ideas, accepting lotteries as a principle of government is so revolutionary. So it has a long history, as you probably know, but presently it's so revolutionary that we should be patient and I'm hopefully in 5 or 10 years things have moved in this direction, hopefully.
But we can take that, of course, and now use it also for corporate governance, because indeed you have brought that in for corporate governance as well. So maybe you want to explain our viewers what it's all about and why you would also suggest it to use it for corporate governance reasons.
Yeah, the main.
Margit, I think we need to explain what sortition is. I think many people will now be looking with big eyes and say, random what? So I think you need to explain briefly what it is.
Sortition is another expression for random selection or lotteries. And lotteries have been applied for thousands of years, for example, in ancient Athens. Aristotle, by the way, he thought that lotteries are the only real form of democracy because their equality is 100%. To be honest, in Athens, slaves and women were excluded. So there you again can see what zeitgeist means. But among male adults, the government was selected by lotteries because lotteries have a lot of advantages. For example, that voices which otherwise are suppressed, have a voice. And that's an important thing for the applicants to apply random selection in corporate governance, because the stakeholders, we have many stakeholders. We have much more stakeholders than we have shareholders. It could be if the employees are 5,000 plus customers, it can sum up to 10 or 20,000 of stakeholders. So how to represent 20,000 stakeholders? You could do it by election. But election have a lot of disadvantages as well, in particular that only these ones who have the biggest hand off and speak the loudest are the representatives. So random selection represents a really representation in the statistical sense. And that's the important thing, so that outsiders, newcomers, women, foreigners, migrants has a chance to have a voice at the highest level, and that's the idea.
I think it's very interesting. The two thoughts that come up for me. One, if I understood it correctly, in the Athenian society, certainly the pool was based on volunteers. So people would actually say, okay, I'm willing to come into this. It wouldn't necessarily be the full population, but people would be allowed to say, do I want to be part of the pool or not? And secondly, there seemed to have been a principle that certain roles in the governments were declared technical, like the military role, for example.
Oh, you're very informed, yes, yeah, right.
and those roles were not up for sortition. So there's almost like, maybe then again talking about your point on institutions, I think we would need to ensure that we make roles available, so that we say, actually, let's train up people so they can step into these roles, and let's make the roles more generic so they're not so technical, which arguably at the highest levels of an enterprise is probably the case. They become less and less technical in my experience, right? But secondly, I think there is a necessity to invest in the capabilities of people to be part of a democratic society almost. And is that not something that today is lacking? Where I think, again, I can't remember, Antoinette, it was either Henry or Paul describing that, Bill Torbett was talking about how people use their leisure. And in this isolationist society, of course, describing the United States, people are spending their leisure sitting in front of the television, so to speak, and eating popcorn. And that is a very dark view of what people do, and hopefully not correct. But is in an individualistic society not the desire to participate a real problem? So would we not need to start there at the same time?
First of all, the member of the board at the moment are also not always very well informed. This I can report from my own experience. That's the first thing. This is true, by the way, also for politicians. They are not always as well informed as we would expect. That's the first thing. The second thing is we know from social psychology and from an article I always cite from Matthias Benz and Alois Stutzer, who found out that if you give people the opportunity to participate in decisions, they inform themselves. So this is a virtuous circle. And the people in the United States, they are sitting lazy in front of their TV because they have nothing to say. Why should they inform themselves? This crazy system, doesn't give them any opportunity to really participate in important decisions. That's a background, and that's a very important principle we use in educating children. Today we know you have children to give a say, and then they inform themselves, and the same is true for adults.
And I think that's exactly what we've seen in the Athenian society. Suddenly people realize, I can make a difference, I'd better get myself up to speed. So I think you're probably very right that we might need to start with changes in the institution. And Antoinette, I'm thinking again, I've forgotten the name, the gentleman at University College London, who is proposing institutional democracy as a modification of democracy to have much greater representation. I think, Margit, we will probably...
Is it Collins?
That could very well be the case. I think we will pick your suggestions up with him, because I know he was looking at a framework. I don't know whether referenda were part of it, but I think it will be very interesting. And liquid democracy, I think, is another one on our list. But I wanted to ask you one more question on, you just said even politicians or board members are not very well informed at times. And you have, of course, as many people I'm sure know, been part of boards like Swiss Post and other big companies. There has been a lot of debate in the United Kingdom about the role of board members, because the question is, can anyone with a large, complex organization as an external ever be fully informed or informed enough to truly be held accountable for the direction of the firm? And I would suggest from my own experience, I mean, I had hard times as an internal to be fully aware of what was going on and check compliance and that everything was going in the right direction. So I cannot imagine that a board member could actually play that role truly successfully. What is your experience and what is your suggestion?
In general, I agree, and therefore it's so important that on the board there's a combination of internals and externals. In particular, the German form of co-determination, I really like. It's a very good corporate governance system, because there are people from on the basis of the corporation, and they can tell you what happens at the shop floor. That's very important. So you have to look for institutions that really mix up people from internal people as well as external people. External people are also sometimes very important, because they can bring in fresh new ideas that the internals are a little bit narrowed in their mind. So I think diversity in general is a very important thing at the board. Of course, the German co-determination system is not a perfect one. We now have a big scandal with a German with a co-determination, or the director of the employees with VW. By the way, he has the same name as me, Bernd Osterloh. It's not a relative of me. He earns 750,000 a year, so that's a big scandal. So VW co-determination is not a good example for German co-determination system, but I think in general it works much better.
And not for morality, by the way, either, right? And the fact that nobody has ever gone to prison for the scandals in Volkswagen, I would suggest, is a bit of a joke. But that's my private opinion. But
never can tell me that the Betriebsrat Bernd Osterloh didn't know anything. That cannot be.
For 10 years? I mean, I'm sorry, then they should go because they didn't know, right? If you're so uninformed, you're not adding a lot of value.
I think I have to cut you now, otherwise we get in troubles if we are talking like this in an official plenary. But I'm just trying, again, to summarize a little bit, because then we can look at your suggestions how to institutionalize that in organizations, because at the end you did most of your research a very long time in organizations. So I heard what we need in order to have kind of an institutional democracy in organizations is to enable participation. We have to take care of the power discussion. So more power over rather than just power with. We heard that self-determination is important. And I think in an earlier article, you said we also need confrontation with social problems and conflicts. So I guess that was overcoming defensive routines so that we really can discuss. And we need to learn more from this confirmation. I just try to kind of summarize what you have written and told us today. Now, what does this mean exactly for organizations? Is there an archetype where you see this is more likely to happen? If we go inside organizations, how can I organize this?
In general, as in my organization theory lecture, I always plea for overlapping groups, which is a mixture between hierarchy on the one hand, there is a hierarchy, and on the other hand, within groups, there could be a high degree of participation. And I think one can realize this idea more or less under different circumstances. But this is an idea in general, which is in between the tension of hierarchy on the one hand, and we cannot have a company without any form of hierarchy and self-determination on the other hand.
So I think this is just one quick question, Antoinette, because of course we're coming straight from the Renden Hayi Open Talk series last week, and Haier, the white good manufacturer in China, suggesting a Chinese model of organization, which I think would challenge your notion that we cannot have that ambivalence between autonomy and control without hierarchy. And Haier has created 4,000 micro enterprises where basically the teams that you mentioned have full autonomy, especially over recruitment, over pay and salaries, and over decision making, within a context of a few norms that are pressed for at the organization level. One is you have to deliver at least 1.5 times the sector profit. And secondly, you have to make use in a preferential way of internal services, unless you can explain that someone else is better suited. So HR, finance, and other distributed functions. And that is a very interesting model because it really pushes the entrepreneurship in the company whilst maintaining cohesion. And they have now managed also to embed external companies into ecosystems. But of course, the big discussion is, does this only work in a Confucian-style Chinese collectivist context where there's enough balancing? Or could we transport this into European companies and American companies? And that was the big debate. But I'm just wondering, so in a nutshell, after all of this, is there not a form of organizing where hierarchy becomes less relevant?
Of course, we could think of companies which are organized more or less hierarchical. But as soon as you have central services, for example, HR services, or controlling services, or marketing services, then you have economies of scale to realize or you would like to realize economies of scale. A central HR division, for example, works better than a decentralized HR, or a centralized controlling. A completely decentralized controlling is not possible. So these are, so to say, common goods. which are to be created and from which every member of the company in the decentralized units can profit. But to organize these centralized services, this means a certain kind of hierarchy, because you have to make sure that in every department, for example, the controlling rules are applied in the same way. Otherwise, there is no controlling. And as soon as you have decentralized common rules, then a form of hierarchy is inevitable.
Maybe I can take that up, because you are now also starting to talk about the corporate commons. So, for instance, you could also add absorptive capacity, which is another corporate commons, or some degree of shared implicit knowledge is a corporate commons. Now, you've written a lot about what it takes to organize the corporate commons in organizations, and maybe we can kind of try to frame it from this side, because indeed, this is a big discussion I have with Otti also. I always say it's difficult to really produce corporate commons in that kind of setting.
Of course, there are to realize corporate governance. There are, in principle, two different ways. The one is power hierarchy, and the other is Elinor Ostrom has taught us co-determination in the small units. This means that the bigger the company is, the more difficult is it to really manage this in different small units. So corporate, no, I should say it otherwise. On the one hand, there is power. It could be managed from top down. How let me say human resources should work, but also you could imagine that there is a strong spirit in the company who tells you about the principle of corporate governance, the bottom up. And again, you have to look for a mixture of both principles, which you can set into your company. You shouldn't do it never in the hierarchical top-down way only. You probably will not succeed in doing it solely in the bottom-up way. It will cost a lot of transaction costs. So you have to look how in reality you put in practice both principles.
And I think here, Antoinette, this goes back to Fiske, right? The discussion we had on a horizontal individualist model. And I think, Margit, even Mary Parker Follett, right? So one of the ignored female wonderful economists from almost 120 years ago would have suggested that the capability of integration from the differentiation for autonomy to this kind of reintegration for the common good, but also for corporate effectiveness is really what matters most. And we were talking to Carol Sanford, who certainly would advocate that can ever only happen if we've got agency in every individual participant in the system. And secondly, I say, and I don't know, Antoinette, how we would frame this, but something that is almost like a willingness, Paul Adler would say, an ethos of participation, an ethos of interdependence to become part of the common
trust, of course, as well.
Trust, vulnerability to mutual power, sort of, or mutualist power. So maybe, so is structure enough, or do we need to also kind of lighten up that spirit in the individual to realize they're part of something greater? So without love, can it ever work?
I absolutely agree. If there is a common spirit in the company, then it was much easier to realize corporate commons. That's for sure. But common spirit is not so easy to create. The more differentiated a company is, the more diverse it is, the less easy it is. We should realize that. And markets also play a role, don't forget that.
Exactly. So we might need to revisit Williamson, because this idea of the corporation's boundaries are determined by transaction costs. Maybe that is really out of date, and we need to look at the corporate boundaries should be determined on our ability to create commons that are a subset of the good society, of the commons that transcend the boundaries of the organization. And if that capability is not there, we should probably tax organizations to reconduce themselves to a meaningful size, because they've lost the plot.
One could think of a revival of transaction costs if you take in physical, psychic costs and advantages, like the Akerlof concept of identity costs or identity advantages.
Wonderful idea.
Which means there are other costs and advantages than only in the form of money. And I think that's important. And many young people today, they love to work in a company where they are convinced of the products. That's nothing else than psychological advantages.
And I think if we argue,
they accept to earn less than, let me say, in another company. Yeah, and if we would be able to put that into transaction costs, then transaction costs economics is okay.
I would almost argue for transaction value.
Yeah, that's what I just wanted to say.
It
exists, by the way. It even exists, and I find that a better theory, because you also have to invest. It's not only a cost, and that's very important.
Yeah. And it goes back to Colin Meyer's point that organizations are such only ex ante by public fiat. And if they don't contribute to the society that allows us to create them, then they really shouldn't exist, and we should probably tax the hell out of them. But again, Margit, really nice. We will take this idea on board. I think, Antoinette, that's a good one. Back to you.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm kind of still hammering on the same. You have also written about Wikipedia, and you have written about open source. These are no small they're no companies, but they're not small organizations. In a traditional way, they're not even an organization. How does it function there? Because there is no hierarchy, I think so, in open source. I'm wrong.
That's not true. That's not true. Unfortunately, in the beginning, Wikipedia as well as open source has less or nearly no hierarchy, but today in Wikipedia there's a lot of hierarchy. I have never contributed to Wikipedia, to be honest, but some people tell me that you cannot post anything. There is a strong hierarchy, and that might be the reason why, unfortunately, Wikipedia doesn't function as well as it did. Maybe you have realized, as I did, some articles are really not very informative. And the reason might be that this kind of hierarchy today doesn't motivate people to contribute voluntarily as it did in the beginning.
Okay, then unfortunately that example of a corporate commons company is not very helpful any longer. That brings us a little...
It is helpful because it tells us that to make people contribute voluntarily to such a big thing as Wikipedia is, it must be, hierarchy must be dampened to a very high degree. Of course, everybody accepts a certain kind of hierarchy if you know this is a person who really knows about. But this kind of police they have installed nowadays, as Wikipedia people tell me, that will kill Wikipedia on the long run. By the way, that's a very interesting example. And thank you that you mentioned this interesting issue.
And it almost reminds me, Antoinette, about what you mentioned to Henry Mintzberg about professional bureaucracies, which was one of the 6 archetypes that Henry was looking at. Whereas, of course, Henry would suggest we go to these newer versions of adhocracy. But I think in his mind, there's also a lot of contextuality in one sector, one context. A certain archetype might just work better, which brings me from Wikipedia to another very interesting analysis that I think, Margit, you and Bruno have been working on, monasteries. What can we learn from the monks, if anything?
First, we can learn that cloisters were a highly democratic society. Most people do not know. They elect their high-ranked people, and this let me say for 2,000 years. That's astonishing. That's absolutely great. That's the first thing. We should learn from monasteries. Second, that we would call it today corporate culture or corporate sense making, which is very important in monasteries, as it is with Wikipedia and these institutions. And the third one is that we have compared two forms of corporate governance, so to say, in the Benedictine cloisters. Which one works better? An abbot who comes from outside the monastery, or an abbot who was elected from inside? And the interesting outcome of this research is inside abbeys are the better ones. We measured is with the success of these monasteries in economic terms. By the way, if they were not successful in economic terms, they died. We know that. They went bankruptcy. So economics were very important. And on average, the inside abbots were the better ones. The reason why is that the information asymmetry, which we talked about former in companies, is reduced if you have an inside person, which does not mean that inside corporate directors are always the better ones, because we know inside versus outside. Inside, there is less information asymmetry, but they are a little bit more independent, a little bit more dependent. Outside directors, there is the information asymmetry bigger, but they are to a certain extent more independent. So that's a trade-off between these two principles. And in monasteries, obviously, it was the advantage of less information asymmetry was dominating. So these are the three issues we find. And by the way, monasteries are such a special kind of organization. They are so special, they are so fascinating, that even today there are young people who are devoted to this special kind of living. That's absolutely fascinating.
I remember another thing you were writing about, and we were also told when we used to have that seminars in cloisters, and that was this review. I found it very interesting, which makes it the review process. Like
oh yeah. Thank you for reminding us that in cloisters there is a kind of external control named visitation. Visitation means that an outside person from another cloister comes from time to time and exerting a kind of control, so that inside businesses have less chance. Thank you for that, for mentioning that. That was very important for the functioning of the cloisters.
And I think the other thing, Antoinette, that we picked up with Simon Western was this idea of formation of monks, which then Bill Torbert also, I think, commented on, in terms of becoming a leader seems to be much more of an experiential growth process in a community. And I think Simon Western talked about finding the priest within. So this formation process was really like a crafting process that in monasteries people would go through, which sounds very different to our today's recruitment.
Very interesting point, yes.
We call that very technically input control, Margit.
Yeah.
So I think you also had a look at the input control very strongly.
Input control, yes, and input development.
So, shall we try a summary? Do you want to?
I want to ask one more question to Margit.
Okay.
I want to go with the final question, and then we go into the final 15 minutes, and we'll focus a little bit on leadership in academia. Actually, I wanted to ask you another thing, Margit. You wrote about the curse of the Oscars, which I find is fascinating. I've never heard about this.
Yeah.
But before that, I wanted to ask you, if you were the next appointed CEO let's say in a company like Reif Eigen,
Yeah.
what would be, you think, the most important leaders to create, levers, the most important ways to create a good organization? What are the 1, 2, 3 things you would look at in trying to find out where you can potentially create a better business?
To allow the highest degree of diversity which is possible. We know diversity is also, there are trade-offs. We can have too much diversity, then a company will not function, but less diversity is a worst thing. Another way would be to install, this is an idea of Bruno, an advocatus diaboli, or maybe we come to this later, a lottery, which means that these are all kinds of mechanisms which allow hierarchies not to flower too much, which always dampens hierarchies because it tells people there are other things you should have in mind than your own meaning. Hybris is a really high danger in companies, and in advocatus diaboli, diverse, different and diverse voices, as well as lotteries, are good institutions to dampen these hybris.
And it's really interesting, Antoinette. You remember Bill Torbett speaking about at the higher levels of maturity as a leader, you almost always, you need to find yourself a jester. You need to find yourself someone who's constantly contrarying and bringing you to different viewpoints, so you're not becoming too convinced of yourself. And I think that's really the hubris idea, Margit, at both individual and collective level, I guess, right? So you can probably have both. Yeah. And just for finishing us off, the curse of the Oscar, what is that?
Oscar curse means that's an issue in gender economics, and I'm dealing a lot with gender economics, and that means that still today there are preferences with men, but also with women, that men should be the winners. Women who win in competitions, in particular in male domains, they are not beloved. They lose. They are thought of being bitchy and so on. And this is also true between couples. We have some statistical evidence that as soon as a wife earns more than 50% of the family income, then the divorce rate jumps up. We have really some impressive evidence on that. And by the way, this is evidence from the United States. And at the moment, an assistant of mine tries to find out whether this is true also in Switzerland, and whether there are differences between more conservative and less conservative cantons. So it could have to do something with conservative mindset. And that's the issue. Or the origin was that it was found out that if a woman has won the Oscar prize, she was much more, the percentage of being divorced was much higher than when a man won an Oscar prize. And that gave the whole thing the name, Oscar's curse, that as soon as in a relationship, the woman is more successful than the man in different dimensions, then there is some danger.
And I think, let's summarize and go to the final section. But Margit, I was just reading actually an essay about research methodologies, where someone was taking an interpretivist symbolic stance. And he was suggesting that if we forget about the symbolic connotations of communication and how we interpret the world, we might miss a very important piece. And I think there is nothing more symbolic than this Oscar prize. So I think there's a lot of symbolism embedded in how we interpret our world.
But it still tells us that even today, gender stereotypes are so strong that one cannot believe. And the bad thing is, as I told in the beginning, we have empirical evidence that with the wealth of the nations and with the development of the countries, these stereotypes don't. They even the gap between the stereotypes becomes bigger, not smaller. That's the sad thing, but that's the case.
Incredible. Antoinette, summary.
Yeah, great. I just was kind of guessing it could have something to do with this very, very difficult development we're also tackling with. This leadership development, if that is possible at all, which just means that kind of the maturation you have also the very early talked about is maybe getting even more difficult. And it has something to do with something you were saying, this learning from this confirmation, the ability to confront social problems. That might be more difficult today than it used to be because we're so used to consumerism, hedonic treadmill, and all that kind of thing. So we have to take it, I think, very serious what you were saying, how organizations would have to look like. And what I take from it is clearly that you say, well, if this is a large company, we need, of course, decentralization because this enables at least self-determinations, that enables to give power where power needs to be, that enables local learning, but we still have the integration problem. And for the integration problem, we might turn to hierarchy because that's still an efficient solution. We might also turn to sociocracy, which you mentioned. And you were a little bit skeptic whether there are so much more abilities as long as companies are still so big. And I think I just want to bring in addition, what we just discussed in the end. Should we also get better in this handling conflicts, which is, of course, also apparent if we have diversity? And what would we need to learn for organizations in order to be also offering challenge and not only harmony, which we also seem to be needing. Now I was going way beyond probably because my mind was kind of doing
and I think we will need to go to the final section. I will take from this, I think we've covered a lot of ground, Margit. Thank you very much. Boards, we talked about boards, different forms of boards, and I think, Antoinette, one for us to look at. Margit, you mentioned the co-determination model. I think, Antoinette, Alex Edmonds from London Business School would have a more skeptical perspective on co-determination. I think also with Paul Adler, we will talk about union representation, so I think we need to dig a little bit into this. We then looked at organizational forms, and I think, Antoinette, you already brought it all in. I think this random sortition and random selection and how to generally avoid hubris is certainly something I'm taking away. Cloisters, super interesting. I think we will talk to someone, maybe if Stefano Zamani is helping us. And corporate commons, I think this for me is still one of the most important concepts, and the idea to revise Williamson I find very appealing. So I think that might be some further research to be done. And I think if that's an okay segue, I would suggest final section. We wanted to talk about leadership and transformation. And I would almost suggest, we have 10 minutes. I would almost suggest, Antoinette, we focus on education because I know, Margit, you've written critically about education. So again, as usual, Antoinette, do you want to kick us off here?
Well, I mean, I'm very glad that you were always very outspoken about the flaws of academia and probably also even more so for business schools. And you have been trying to reform it for the last 30 years. But I would like to start with a more general question. What do you believe at present are the biggest obstacles that academia is really kind of contributing more to what companies and society really need to learn and to get further?
To say it very short, rankings. I think rankings, academic rankings, is a thing which contradict fundamentally to the idea of scholarly work. To say it very simple, because ranking reduces scientific work to counting. and academic work should be on arguing. So that's quite the contrary. Mm-hmm. And to be more in detail, rankings, the effect of rankings is that people are more extrinsically motivated because they look at the ranking position, and they look less on the contents. And I think that's a big failure of our academic system today. Yeah.
And is there not a... Oh, sorry, Antoinette, go on.
No, go ahead. Okay.
I wanted to connect it with, you remember our conversation about healthcare management with Henry. Mm-hmm. And Margit, I'm wondering, is there not a wider issue with, I think it's called public management, right? So this notion that public institutions, if do I get this right? I don't know
public management, probably, yeah.
Public management, that institutions, which include universities, but also, for example, healthcare providers have to be managed based on efficiency metrics and even profit metrics. Mm-hmm. Is there not a wider connotation that certain things should not be run like a business, because that's really not what their value creation is about?
Mm-hmm. So that's a bit in between. Of course, also hospitals must be managed in an efficient way. And accounting is efficient is necessary also for hospitals. But hospitals, public hospitals, or not all hospitals, could be managed in a way like profit-oriented companies. That's for sure. You can compare, for example, university hospital on the one hand and private hospitals on the other hand, which means that in the private hospitals they don't take the really severe cases because they don't bring too much money. And so the division between private hospitals on the one hand for the people who can afford a private room with a 5-star hotel service is quite okay. And these kind of hospitals, they should make profits. And Hills London, for example, and maybe they make profits. But on the other hand, a university hospital cannot be run like a company, that's for sure. But they should have an accounting department which tells them that efficiency sometimes could be improved.
Yeah, I think Henry came up with the necessity for efficiency, but I think he summarized it as care over cure. So the necessity and then I think community over control. So those were his stances.
Yeah, yes, and I would agree. I would agree fully.
But and what about in the business school? What is that not the same? And I recall being a London Business School alumni. I recall that in 2007 or so, the slogan of London Business School was to become the preeminent business school in the world, right? So it's the notion of we just want to be the best, whatever. And it changed over the years to something changing the way the world does business. So much more focused on the quality of business in organizations. Mm-hmm. But I think there is a trend in business schools in general to be money earning over necessarily being good in an ethical sense.
Yeah, it's interesting that, for example, the Harvard Business School, of course, is they make profits, but they can afford a lot of scholars because they have such a high reputation and they are funded to such a high degree. The same is true for Oxford and other.
Not in the rankings. They're not in the rankings. So in the end, maybe you are right in your analysis. They have taken themselves out and say we have our own standards, and we still kind of try to think as well. But I want to drill down more. Is it really only the rankings? I mean, Otti now went to other possible drivers as well. But I mean, I'm hearing you said research is not relevant any longer. So we don't produce anything which is of knowledge or producing wisdom for practice. I think we have very few academics who are like intellectuals like you, who are really J'accuse. That's also something I don't see very often. And there's also very few transdisciplinary research. So is this only ranking, or do we need to even look for further reasons and then also, of course, solutions to make academia better for the common good again?
Rankings are connected with status. Rankings create status, and status are kill argumentation. So another issue which is linked to status question is that in most countries, with the exception of Switzerland, we have too much so-called academics. You know that in Germany, you have more students at universities and then in an apprenticeship. Switzerland, fortunately, is different. We have only 35% of an age cohort going on a university and Fachhochschule, and the rest is doing an apprenticeship. And I think this is because apprenticeship and doing a job like this has a high status in Switzerland, but it doesn't have a high status, for example, in France or Spain or in Italy. Why? Because they don't have the system of apprenticeship, which gives you a relative high prestige without being an academic. And I think most universities today suffer from that everybody wants to have an academic degree, which is not real an academic degree, and they don't need to have an academic degree. So you and I, we know that there are sitting a lot of boys and girls sitting in the floor who are not really interested in scholarship. And that's an indirect consequence of the rankings, because rankings give status, and status, that's my argumentation. And it's connected, of course, with the Bologna process, which also presses you to count points.
So we look for the wrong places. We should look for our applied universities. We should look for the professional bodies who work with this apprentice, because there we really also have actionable knowledge and it's embedded into practice. That's what I'm hearing here.
That's exactly. I'm in the University Council of University Erlangen-Nuremberg, and they recently introduced an academic bachelor for Hebammen. What is Hebammen in English?
No, what's a Hebamme? It's not a nursing woman, it's a midwife.
A midwife, an academic degree for midwives. And I fought fiercely, but I didn't succeed. And the other colleague who fought with me, he told what will happen. The midwives now will sit in an office on a white desk, and in the Kreissaal, there sit people who don't have a good education, good practical education. And what are they do is make seasons as much as they can, because they cannot manage it better. So this is a crazy system, which is forced by the EU, by the way, enforced by the EU.
Yeah, that was very interesting and would lead us into another Aristotelian discussion. But because time is running out, I think Otti is going to do a lightning round with you, if I'm correct.
The final quiz. But firstly, Margit, it was a sublime pleasure. Thanks for making time for us. And as anticipated and as hoped for, such a great, wide-ranging conversation. It was very, very enjoyable. Thank you. And as always, we want to close us out. In psychology and in coaching, we say there always has to be closure. So our closure is a quick 1-minute quiz where we will just throw a few things at you for a short reaction, whatever comes to your mind. And I want to add one, which we wanted to ask Henry, but forgot. And I think you're the perfect person to answer it. So CEO multiples. I think Paul Adler, in his book, The 99% Economy, suggests that in the 1990s, the average multiple CEO pay for the top 100 organizations in America was around 400 times. In the last 10 years, it was about 1,000 times. In Mondragon, I think the limit is 10 times for any role. And Antoinette was suggesting that maybe CEOs should be paid even less than a one-time multiple because they're having most fun, as research tells us. So what is the ideal CEO pay multiple from your perspective?
I would look at a procedural way, and that means, for example, if CEOs are selected by lot, then it is quite sure that the multiple would be probably not greater than 10 to 20, because the hierarchy would be changed completely with such a system. You can't.
Wonderful. 10 to 20, I take that. Antoinette, we certainly got to quote you on this one, Margit.
But this is an outcome of a process, not of an ex ante decision.
Absolutely. No, I think that is very clear, the procedural fairness. To learn more about the good life, I would prefer to meet the Pope, fly in a rocket with Elon Musk towards Mars, or spend a year traveling, or anything else?
Nothing.
None of the above.
Nothing.
Good societies need good leaders, good rules, and I will add procedures based on what you said, or good citizens, or anything else.
Good rules, good procedures, that's quite sure.
Good procedures and rules, very interesting.
Yes.
We got some philosophers on the list: Immanuel Kant, John Rawls, or John Stuart Mill.
Of course, Kant.
Of course, Kant.
Of course.
Lottery or meritocracy?
Yeah, of course, lottery.
You have to go with lottery on this one, otherwise we would be very disappointed. I won't ask about, actually I will, a European, an Asian, or a US model. Where's your heart?
I prefer to live in Europe.
Europe. And then that leads me to my next question. Switzerland or Germany?
Switzerland.
Switzerland. We will bring this back to our German colleagues. And finally, if I had a magic wand and I could do one thing to change the world, what would you do?
So I have realized that question I've written is the following. In former times, ordo-liberal economist Franz Böhm, he told us competition is the most ingenious instrument for disempowerment. Today, I would say, as in ancient Athens, focal lotteries are the most ingenious instruments for disempowerment.
Wonderful. I mean, we couldn't close it better. So nothing remains. Antoinette, final words to you.
No, I'm just happy. It was very, very interesting, as I thought it would be. And thank you very much. Really, it was very, very nice.
It was a great fun for me. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to think about what is important in my life. That's a great occasion.
Wonderful.
We did a big tour as well, and it's amazing over the time.
Yeah.
And with that, we close. Thank you very much. Thanks also to the listeners, and speak to you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for myself. Bye-bye.